Hey everyone, welcome back to LabCoatz. So, I feel like I've shared quite a bit about myself on this channel. Like my name, my hometown, my face. But one thing that I've never shared before is that I have a very serious addiction to root beer. I love the stuff. Seriously, I've tried so many varieties that it's borderline obsession. But a while ago, I learned something about my favorite beverage that made me just a little sad. Modern root beer is no longer made from roots, or even the main ingredient from the roots that originally gave it its flavor. You see, old-fashioned root beer was essentially a fizzy, sweetened tea made from the roots of the sassafras tree, which is loaded with a sweet-smelling oil called safrole. This was the key flavoring agent for hundreds of years, until the government stepped in. In the United States, safrole is banned from being used in food products because, in high doses, it can apparently cause health issues in lab rats. And when I say high doses, I mean really high doses, like the equivalent to what you get from drinking more than 30 bottles of soda in a single day. And while later studies did conclude that safrole can be used safely as a flavoring agent, the US still hasn't reinstated the compound as a legitimate food additive. So if you want to experience the original flavor of root beer without traveling to Europe, your only option is to extract the safrole yourself and make your own soda. So naturally, that's exactly what I set out to do. Before I could start though, I first had to get myself some sassafras root. Now, while you can purchase sassafras in some stores, it's basically impossible to get with the safrole still in it. So really, it's best to just dig up the roots for yourself. Thankfully, this wasn't actually too difficult for me to do. I live in an area where wild sassafras is fairly common, so during a visit to my family's lake cabin, I took the opportunity to look for some in the nearby woods. And luckily, I found some almost immediately. Sassafras is fairly easy to identify thanks to its iconic leaves, which are typically shaped like either mittens or duck feet. So as soon as I spotted some, I went to work yanking a few up. It took a while, but in the end, this is what I got. So now, the big question. How do you get the safrole out of the root? Well, interestingly, there are a few options. For one, we could simply perform a solvent extraction using something like acetone or dichloromethane. This method is certainly viable, but it probably wouldn't be the best for what I'm doing. Even the best solvents have trouble pulling out all the safrole, and there's also the possibility that they would take up some other less desirable compounds. And of course, there's also the risk that some of the solvent could remain in the final product, which isn't the best for something that I'm planning to use in food. On the other hand, steam distillation is an option that is not only cleaner, but also somewhat easier. For this, you simply chop up whatever you want to extract, mix it with water, and distill off the oil without any of the non-volatile junk or toxic solvents. Pretty nice, right? Of course, before running the distillation, I had to prepare the sassafras root. Since most of the oils are in the outer layers of the root bark, this is the part most people focus on. So, with a knife, I stripped each root of its bark, continuing until the smell of safrole was no longer present in the peelings. From my sample, I ended up with about 85 grams of usable sassafras, which was added to a blender with some water. Breaking up the root is good for safrole recovery, but it's important not to blend everything into a paste, since that could lead to scorching on the flask bottom. Once the blending was done, the resulting sassafras mixture was added to a 500 milliliter boiling flask with a bit of extra water, and the distillation was carried out. I tried tossing in a stir bar to help everything boil smoothly, but there was a bit too much sassafras for this to work effectively. As things began to boil, a murky liquid could be seen collecting in the condenser head, and once the liquid made it to the receiving flask, a heavy oily substance began separating from the water. This oil is mostly safrole, along with a few other compounds from the sassafras like pinene and eugenol. And let me tell you, this stuff smelled amazing as it was distilling. In case it wasn't obvious based on what I'm making, this stuff smells almost exactly like root beer tastes, although more natural and a bit like turpentine, probably thanks to the traces of pinene collected alongside it. It took several hours and a few more additions of boiling water, but in the end, I had a whole flask full of safrole water. Since safrole is denser than water, most of it sank to the bottom of the flask, and I used a separatory funnel to isolate it. I also tried crushing up more of the oil with salt, but surprisingly, that really didn't work. I'm guessing there was just too much water present for it to effectively separate. I could have done a solvent extraction with something like ether or DCM, but that honestly seemed like more effort than it was worth. So, getting back to my sample, the next thing I had to do was purify it. Close to the end of the distillation, I scorched some of the sassafras, which led to the sample taking on a slight yellow color. So, I prepared a few milliliters of aqueous sodium hydroxide and added it to my contaminated safrole. Typically, this is done to pull out the eugenol, but I was kind of hoping it would also take care of the color and slightly off smell. And lo and behold, it actually did. The upper aqueous layer became a noticeable shade of yellow, and the saffrole seemed noticeably cleaner. So I washed the oil a few times with water, and finally dried it over a small amount of calcium chloride. In the end, I came out with about 2 milliliters of nice and clear saffrole. This means that roughly 3% of the weight of my sassafras root was saffrole, which is right around the expected amount. Not exactly a ton of material, but still plenty for what I had planned.
Alright, that was my very first steam distillation, and honestly, I don't think it came out half bad. This is about 2 milliliters of saffrole, which I collected from the sassafras, and that should be way more than enough to make the root beer that I'm planning on drinking. But only time will tell if that's going to be any good, so let's get into it.
To make my root beer, I'll just be creating a simple syrup with all the ingredients and mixing with off-the-shelf club soda to give it the required fizz. And speaking of ingredients, they are as follows: 160 grams of sucrose, 470 milliliters of water, 15 milliliters of 40 millimolar vanillin solution, 2 milliliters of 45 millimolar citric acid solution, 1 milliliter of anethol, and approximately 100 microliters of saffrole. Translated back to English, that comes out to roughly 3/4 of a cup of sugar, 2 cups of water, a tablespoon of vanilla extract, a half teaspoon of lemon juice, a quarter teaspoon of anise or licorice extract, and 3 drops of our sassafras oil. I also chose to add red and green food dyes to give my final product that rich brown root beer color that we're all used to. To get started, I filled a small saucepan with the water and then measured out the sugar. Personally, I went with a 50-50 mix of brown sugar and white sugar, since brown sugar has a more dynamic, caramely flavor that works well with the root beer. This was added to the water and mixed well until dissolved. Turns out I didn't actually need the saucepan, since all the sugar went into solution relatively quickly without heating. So, moving on, I next add the vanilla, lemon juice, and anise extract, along with a pinch of salt. Now, I know at this point some of my fellow root beer connoisseurs are probably shouting at their screens, "Zach, where's the wintergreen?" That's actually a good question. Sadly, I didn't have any, but believe me, I would have added it along with the other flavors if I had some. Like licorice or anise, wintergreen is one of those underlying flavors in root beer that you don't realize belongs there until it's not present. Forgetting it wasn't the end of the world, but after comparing my root beer to the commercial stuff, I could definitely tell it was missing. Now, at this point, the only other component that needed to be added was the saffrole. And believe me, I was very careful about how much I put in. Based on the LD50, saffrole may seem fairly safe, with it apparently taking more than an ounce to risk fatally poisoning someone of my size. However, some other records claim that it can take as little as 5 milliliters to kill you, which makes saffrole sound more like cyanide than a flavoring agent. However, it's important to remember that this is around the same level of toxicity as wintergreen oil, which is ingested safely by millions of people every day. Still, there was no way I was going to use my entire 2 milliliter sample, so I settled on using the maximum amount that would dissolve in water, which ended up being around 3 drops. Once the saffrole was added, I poured everything into a jar and shook the mixture vigorously until I had a nice, homogeneous syrup. Then, I added a few drops of red and green food color, and with that, my old-fashioned root beer syrup was done. So now, to complete my journey and finally make my own root beer, all that was left was to add the fizz. And for that, I used the club soda I mentioned earlier. Personally, I went a little heavier on the syrup to mimic a more traditional root beer flavor, and I ended up adding about 1 part syrup to 2 parts soda. On ice, of course. However, if you aren't into the sweetness of the store-bought stuff, using 3 parts soda water might be preferable. Regardless, here was my first experience tasting authentic, saffrole-based root beer.
Alright, here we are. Got our homemade root beer made from the saffrole that we extracted from sassafras. See how it tastes. Tastes like root beer. But I will say, it doesn't taste exactly like a name brand root beer, like A&W or something. It tastes more like a soda you'd get from like a soda shop or something like that. It's definitely not bad, but it is more natural and herbal, which makes sense. I mean, it came from saffrole, from a plant. Overall, I would give this a 7 out of 10, honestly. I mean, if you were to serve this to me at a party or a restaurant, I probably wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between it and just an ordinary root beer. So, I call it a success.
Alright, not surprisingly, saffrole-containing root beer actually tastes quite similar to the modern off-the-shelf stuff that was made to mimic it. Granted, it's not 100% there, but for something that I came up with on my own, I'd say it turned out pretty well. It might not be made from paint thinner or plastic gloves, but by golly, I made a soda from a questionable chemical precursor, and by some miracle, it didn't suck. And that is good enough for me. Although, if I were to do it again, I would add less anise and definitely include wintergreen. Now, before I conclude this video, I actually have something personal to talk about. This is my younger sister Moriah, and she loves to write. In recent times, she has had some struggles with her mental health, and those struggles inspired her to write a fictional book titled Ad Bellum. In this book, she personifies the issues she and others have faced as monsters that the protagonist must face, and knowing what she's been through, I'm very proud of the work she's done. So, to help her out, I'll be posting a link in the video description to her monthly email newsletter. By signing up, you'll be helping Moriah achieve her goal of self-publishing Ad Bellum, which she hopes will go on to positively impact others who have faced similar mental health problems. And if you sign up, you'll also get access to her free flash fiction, Ashes. Again, the links are down below. Alright, as usual, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss out on the crazy stuff I have planned. I'm currently working on everything from Tesla coils to death rays, along with a lot of awesome chemistry projects, so make sure you stick around for the fun. And if you'd like to help support projects like this, I highly recommend joining my Patreon. And speaking of, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank all the existing LabCoatz patrons. Without their support, plenty of my projects wouldn't be anything more than ideas, so I'm truly grateful for their monthly contributions. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. LabCoatz out.